All right, so moving on to predicting species invasions. Another kind of classic, if you like, application of these kinds of methods. Another fairly widely applied and widely debated approach that I want to just give you an introduction to. And I'm going to start with Madagascar. I'm then going to talk you through in more detail a couple of other examples, but keeping some consistency here and interest in Madagascar. So this is very recent. So the cane toad that you may have heard about is invasive in Australia and has caused all sorts of havoc. It's just basically swept in recent years across much of Australia and is bad news for the native flora and fauna. They're big, they're toxic, they're horrible. And a closely related species, the Asian common toad, recently arrived in Madagascar. So we've talked a lot about Madagascar. I mean, amphibians and reptiles, for example, in Madagascar, more than 90% endemic. Huge amounts of endemism. You know, it's a classic kind of biodiversity hotspot. This is potentially not really very good news. So back in earlier this year, there was a letter or a correspondence in Nature that basically reported that we need to stop Madagascar's toad invasion now, was the kind of headline. What they noted was that some of them doing field work in Madagascar had come across one of these Asian common toads, or a few of them, just next to one of the ports. The biggest port in Madagascar, basically, in some of the wetlands around this port where the big ships come in. On the 26th of March earlier this year, they found some of these big toads. So this is the distribution of the common toad. These are data that I downloaded from GBIF. I was immediately interested in thinking, you know, hang on, that's not good news, as they're pointing out. But what might an ecological niche model or distribution model be able to tell us of interest here? So what you're seeing here is the background is just the world CLIM temperature data, mean annual temperature, just to give you an idea of just mean annual temperatures across this large area, and then plotted on top of the GBIF records for where Asian common toads are known to be found throughout Asia, of course. So what we're basically saying is somehow they've been transported across this big ocean and turned up in Madagascar. Think where we started with the BAM diagram. Biotic, abiotic, and movement. Basically, we've broken down the movement element of this, that species has suddenly been moved and has got the opportunity to, occupy a whole nother landscape. So we're interested in what's the biology there, what's the biotic environment, but what we can say something about is what's the abiotic environment like? Is it suitable for the toad? So all I did, frankly, fairly quick effort, was to build a Maxent model, exactly the kind of model that we've been working with. Of course, I've sat on a database of all these data already ready to go for Madagascar. Got the data points for the Asian common toad. Again, there's where it was first identified in March, and just built a model that says, well, where else in the landscape is the environment similar to where it's found in Asia? Because if we assume, okay, think back to the niche evolution session that we've just had, if we assume that in this new environment the niche is likely to be the same as it was in its native environment, the preferred niche, then we would expect this particular toad to invade those parts of the environmental space. Now the bottom line in this case is that there are some areas, particularly along the eastern escarpment, where the environment is particularly suitable. So we would expect to see a high probability that the species is going to invade in those areas. But there aren't actually any areas in Madagascar where the environment is completely dissimilar, is very dissimilar to the native range. So this was it's a case of asking what's the niche of the species that it occupies in its native range, and then where is that niche distributed in the invaded range, and let's highlight that as areas where this invasion is most likely to progress. So this is potentially useful information. There's a big effort going into raising money in that to actually send people out to let's try and stop this invasion before it gets going. And we can use this kind of analysis to start prioritizing where you're more likely to see the invasion spreading to target, the eradication efforts, in effect. So there's one example from Madagascar. Going back to our original diagram, of course, these are kind of type 3 predictions that we're interested in. We're interested in saying we build our model in environmental space, we project it back. We're interested in those parts of the geographic space where the environment is suitable, but we don't currently find the species. But we're asking, what if that geographic barrier breaks down because you've got a big ship that takes this toad and its ballast to the new area, or because you've got trade in live plants, or something like that. But if you break that down, the species arrives here, then what we would expect is that those environments that are similar to where we find the species in its native range are those that are more likely to be invaded. There's a nice review of this, a fairly early review. Again, one of the common authors, Town Peterson, that we keep coming across, Quarterly Review of Biology. If you're interested, I'd start with having a look at that as a general review. But essentially, here's one way of looking at it. We start in geographic space again. We build our model there. The important thing to think is this is the occurrence records. These are the occurrence records for the native distribution. Because what we're trying to do is characterize the niche. We're calibrating the model on the niche of where you find the species, its native distribution. So we characterize the niche in environmental space or ecological space. And then we project it back. We're going to project it usually into the native range because we're going to hope that we get a kind of type 1 prediction that we can just recreate the native range of the species. But we're also interested in projecting it into the invaded range to get these type 3 predictions of where's the species more likely to spread. Another example, this is for Hydrilla verticillata. Can anyone remember what that is? It's a freshwater weed. I should remember the common name of the species. Anyway, it's a freshwater weed that's really becoming quite a problem in North America. Its native range that you see on the left as you're looking at it is throughout much of Southeast Asia and the Australo-Pacific region. And the little spots there that you can see, of course, are the occurrence records. So that's its native range. It's causing all sorts of problems in North America, like clogging up estuaries and clogging up freshwater systems with this kind of nasty weed. So what they were doing was building models from the native range, getting the occurrence records, characterizing the distribution. The dark shading there is the distribution model overlaid on the native range, having built the model, but then projecting it through into the introduced range. The mechanics of doing this aren't dissimilar to when we're doing, say, climate change or something. In that case, you're projecting it under a different time slice in the same region. Here, we're just feeding into the model a different region and asking, well, where is that niche in this other region? And what's quite cool here was that, again, the darker areas are showing where the niche model is saying that these are environments that are similar to where the species is found in its native range. And then you won't see it terribly well, but have a look at the paper. There are little polygons here, little areas that are a database showing those watersheds where that particular species is known to already be invasive. So this is an invasion quite different to the Madagascar example that's literally only just starting. Hopefully it won't go very far. This is, quite a mature invasion, if you like. A lot of these watersheds have been invaded, but you'll see that there's quite a remarkable fit that those regions that have been invaded are in exactly those environments that match the distribution in the native range. Okay? There are some areas, particularly out in California, for example, where there are watersheds that don't seem to have the same kind of environments to the native range. But in general, there's a pretty good fit. Now, this idea of projecting into areas where, you know, this species is invading new niches is quite fundamental and very much cutting edge in terms of, you know, something for you folks to look at, and a lot of work to still be done to ask, when species invade a new region, do they conserve their niches? Do they invade similar niches, or are they going to invade new niches? I don't think there's ever going to be a kind of yes or no answer to that. It's going to be dependent. But there are studies out there, there are debates out there. Antoine Guisan's group has put out studies that have shown that actually species are, in many cases, occupying very distinct, different ecological niches. So there's this debate out there that you might want to get into if you're interested in this area. But, you know, does the species, when it invades a new region, occupy similar niches? Well, we have pretty good evidence for that in some cases. Or are they starting to expand into new regions? Are they evolving to shift their niches? Are they having some sort of competitive release where they can suddenly occupy new niches? A lot of complicated debates that we're not going to dwell on because it would be in a lot longer session, but to emphasize those are the kind of debates that are out there. And just to kind of reiterate some of that, some of the key considerations when you're modeling invasive species, things to be aware of. This idea of niche conservatism that I've just mentioned. Are niches the same in the invaded range and the native range? Is there potential for competitive release? Well, maybe a competitive species is you know, restricting the distribution of a species in its native range, but then when it arrives in a completely new landscape that doesn't have that competitor that it's kind of co-evolved with, maybe it's, you know, going to outcompete the native flora and fauna and invade new niches. If you're doing this kind of study, be very careful. You need to make sure that you are using predictor variables that are geographically kind of consistent or can be transferred across different regions. To give you an example, altitude is one that we've talked about, right? Elevation. 600 to 700 degrees, we said, 600 to 700 meters elevation in Southeast Asia is not going to be the same environmental conditions as in the Arctic or in some other part of the world. So elevation would clearly not be a good, consistent variable to use to characterize the niche of the species. Some more subtle examples would be, you know, you don't want to use, say, rainfall in April. Might be a variable that you generate and you know in your native range. Rainfall in April is really, really important. But rainfall in April in some other part of the world is not the variable that's important. And that's why the WorldClim data sets that we've looked at, the BioClim variables aren't, say, rainfall in April, they are rainfall in the wettest month. Because that's geographically consistent in different parts of the world. Or rainfall in the coldest quarter. Whatever that 3 months is, it might be January through March, it might be, you know, another 3 months in the year. So be very careful. It might sound kind of obvious, but we see these mistakes that the variables that you're using really can be translated across different parts of the globe if you're interested in these big geographic kind of macroecological or biogeographic scales. Another thing in the last example I'm going to show you is that one of the cool things about these invasion or invasive species applications is that you can very often have data from the invaded region that can act as really cool test data. We talked about model evaluation for your model. So you might build your data on the native range, but then as we just showed for the weed in the freshwater weed in North America, you've got these watersheds in North America where we can actually then test based on some new independent data from a completely different region. We can test whether the model is doing what we want it to. So what I want to do, in effect, to finish with, is give you one more example that I think is a really nice one. Another author we've come across Wilfred Tullier, 2005 paper where they looked at using niche-based modelling or species distribution modelling for predicting the risk of alien plant invasions at a global scale. So what they did here was take plants that are native to South Africa, run ecological niche models and predict where the niches might be suitable elsewhere in the globe. So I'll talk you through that, trying to piece together the kind of elements that we've talked through over the last couple of days. So they selected some species, right? And got hold of some occurrence records. They got hold of data for 98 endemic species in South Africa that are known to be invasive elsewhere. And there are some amazing surveys that have been done in South Africa that come up with presence and absences, pretty robust absence data in this case, for a lot of these species in South Africa. There's really good botanical surveys that have been done. These are things like Proteaceae, these really quite grand, cool flowers that are used in the flower trade around the world. So they got hold of some presence and absence distribution data. They got hold of a bunch of environmental data that were carefully chosen because they're known to have direct impacts or direct effects on plant physiology and growth. So temperature of the coldest month, it's a classic one that we've talked about. Growing degree days is another. So this is in effect the sum of positive values above a certain threshold. It's basically a measure of how long during the year are you above a certain minimum temperature, which are classed as kind of growing degree days. How long is the growing season in effect? And then some other variables about potential, evapotranspiration, humidity, plant productivity index related to temperature and seasonality, rainfall seasonality and things. So they very carefully selected and generated some environmental variables, exactly as we've discussed, to generate these models. They then ran a bunch of distribution models or ecological niche models. They used the Biomod approach that we've talked about, where they run not just one algorithm like a generalized linear model or a Maxent model, but they run a whole bunch of different algorithms and then look at consistencies and consensus among those models. And they were using methods that require presences or that use presence and absence data, because in this study they had pretty good surveys and they were pretty confident that their absence data were useful and robust. So they used presences and absences. They calibrated the model on the native range using 70% of their data and then tested against the remaining 30%, okay, in the native range. Exactly what we discussed this morning in terms of a data split, dividing the data into two parts for training or for calibrating and for testing. And then based on that, they calculated an AUC score. Well, we've learnt about AUCs this morning, presence-absence data, presence-absence test data from their 30%, they could calculate AUCs for the native range. And then they presented that in the paper and they found that the median AUC across 96 species was 0.94. And they give the range. Some of them weren't so good and some of them were suspiciously high. But that makes sense, right? Presence and absence models, presence and absence test data, AUC scores, present that in the paper. Essentially, the AUCs were pretty high, so they had some confidence that these models had some predictive performance and were worth persevering with. They then projected those models around the rest of the world. They just took those models that were calibrated and projected them for around the world, and for 3 species that among those that they could get data for, they gathered occurrence records from the non-native distributions. So from where the invasions were occurring, they gathered some occurrence records. Those were records from Europe, from Australia, and from New Zealand. Now, where the invasion is happening, you don't have any confidence in the absences, of course. That would be a real classic case of let's not start really trying to interpret the absence as really meaning that the environment's not suitable. You know, this is an invasion. The whole idea is that the species is invading those environments. So they only had occurrence records, presence records for doing these tests. So they tested the predictive performance using the success rates and binomial tests that we've talked about. Yeah, they actually used a chi-squared test, but that's basically a way of approximating the binomial test. It's very, very similar. It's a similar approach. You have a success rate, how often you get the predicted occurrences correct, and then a significance based on, well, is it actually very useful given the proportion of the area that you're predicting present? And that, of course, is a presence-only assessment of predictive performance. So they use presence-absence, AUC, in the native range where they had that data. In the invaded range, they only had presence data, so they used a success rate combined with a binomial test or a chi-squared test. And they consistently found that the results were statistically significant. So they were building models that were statistically significant predictors of the invasions. Let's look at that. Some pretty pictures, if you like, some of the results. So this is for one of the ice fig, where you can't actually see South Africa under there, just the way the slide is set out, but the models were calibrated for South Africa and then projected to the rest of the world. And you'll see that it seems to be a coastal species. It seems to like environments along the coast. It's invasive in Europe, and it's invasive in Australia. And the little red dots are the occurrence records, presence-only records that were got from the invaded region and used a success rate and a test of statistical significance to show that there is statistically significant coincidence between where the niche is predicted to be and where the invasions are occurring. But you can kind of see that visually, right? We can statistically show it, but it's a kind of pretty cool prediction, I would say. Same for Australia. Another example, an Asteraceae, again calibrated for South Africa, predicted elsewhere in the world, and finding that the species is present in those areas where the niche is similar to that in the native range. One more example, Asteraceae in New Zealand, again, same kind of story. So the models seem to be kind of pretty cool. They were predicting where the invasions might be more likely to occur, right? These kind of type 3 predictions. Well, if you allow the species to arrive there, then these are the environments that you would expect the invasion to occur into. So one thing that they did was take all of those species that they'd modelled and kind of layer them all on top of each other and come up with a more kind of grand conclusion for a map of the risk of invasibility for South African plants in other parts of the world. So some areas that are a much higher risk of invasion down in southern Australia, in California, around some areas of coastal Europe and North Africa, down in South America along the west coast there. Why might that be a useful map? It's a nice academic exercise that shows that the models seem to be doing something useful. Why might that be useful? Yeah, for like quarantine at ports. I started with the example of this toad that's arrived, most likely, pretty certainly, in some ballast in a ship that's arrived in Madagascar. Well, you know, you have lists of quarantine species and species that people are looking out for at ports, and in certain areas of the world, then this is suggesting that those areas need to be particularly on guard for these plants coming from South Africa, because if they arrive, they're more likely to spread. So it's potentially useful in that kind of sense. And they picked out a number of kind of hotspots, if you like, of areas that would be particularly at risk. And then finally, just to finish, they took it one step further. Again, thinking about this idea of movement. Where are these propagules actually coming from? How are these species moving around? The niche models are telling us about environmental suitability. They're not telling us about the potential for the species to actually move there. We talked about climate change. We talked about projecting into the future where the environment might be suitable. But until we coupled it with a demographic model that included dispersal, we didn't really have an estimate of what the likelihood is that the species would actually move there and occupy that area. So what they did was get hold of some cool data, I think, about where plants are being moved. So these arrows here are indicating propagule pressure, where the increase in the thickness in lines is indicating an increase in tourism. And the range from kind of dark black to or black to lighter greys is the amount of trade in live plant products. And then the actual numbers there are the number of South African plant species that have already been recorded as invasive in those regions. So they're combining information on the environmental suitability with where these species are actually being moved around the planet to link that into understanding where invasions are more or less likely. Okay? And as usual, a bunch of references that I will point you towards to at least get you started. It's just really a taster for this rather large field of research. But I think another kind of, cool application of distribution models or ecological niche models.